Alrighty, welcome everyone. Thanks again for your patience as we just waited a few minutes here. You have arrived at How to Kickstart Your Local Government Climate Adaptation Planning, a deep dive into SB 379. We want to thank everyone for carving out some time today from your busy schedules to join us. This workshop is brought to you by Sierra Climate Adaptation and Mitigation Partnership, a program here at Sierra Business Council. My name is Jill Sanford, and I will be co-moderating the discussion today as part of the Sierra Camp team. Before we dive in, we wanted to share an overview of the agenda so you all know what to expect today. We'll be starting off with an overview of climate planning, SB 379 compliance basics, and the adaptation planning guide led by our guest presenter, Nikki Caravelli of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. We'll hand it off to Nikki here shortly for her presentation. Following a Q&A on Nikki's presentation, we'll have a panel discussion with Sierra Nevada region planners to learn more about their experiences complying with SB 379 and incorporating climate planning into their work. Following the discussion, we will again open it up for questions from the audience for our speakers. I'll be monitoring the chat and Q&A today, so please don't hesitate to reach out. We'll also be recording the workshop today and plan to email out that recording later this week to all registrants. And with that, I will go ahead and pass it off to my colleague, Emily, Sierra Business Council's Natural Resources and Economic Development Project Manager, to provide an overview of Sierra Camp's work and kick off the content of today's presentation.
Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you, Jill. So just before we dive into Nikki's presentation, I just want to set the stage a little bit and talk very briefly about why we plan for climate change. I think this probably isn't a new question for most of you folks, but just so we're kind of all approaching the subject on some sort of common ground here. We know that climate change is already happening. I mean, we see it in the natural phenomena around us. This is a picture of Lake Oroville in May of this year. So that's the drought that we're currently experiencing, and then the heat wave that is setting in today for a lot of folks. And these climate changes affect our natural ecosystems, they affect our economy, they affect all of us as individuals and the folks that we know and care about, and they affect our communities. And in particular, we know that as climate change impacts layer on top of each other, vulnerable people and vulnerable places may become even more vulnerable. The good news of all of this is that by preparing for these impacts and planning for these impacts, we can help mitigate them. So that's really our kind of overarching objective in climate adaptation planning, is to understand the potential impacts of climate change and then to plan for them so that we can protect the people that we care about and the places that we care about. Sierra Business Council and Sierra Camp are working on this through a regional climate vulnerability assessment, which is looking at environmental, economic, and community components of climate vulnerability across our region. To understand, as a region, what we face and what we need to do in order to prepare for climate change. Part of this process will include community capacity workshops held in communities across the region to help understand, how our communities are equipped to adjust and adapt to climate change. And then we're also providing technical assistance to local governments, cities and towns and counties, to help them advance their own climate adaptation planning, which you will actually hear more about in the discussion portion of today's webinar. If you're interested in staying up to date on our climate vulnerability assessment across the region, participating in these community workshops, or learning more about technical assistance, I'm going to drop a link in the chat to our sign up list. We don't use it very often, so we won't spam you, but it's a good way to stay abreast of opportunities to get engaged or receive assistance. So without further ado here, I want to pass it off to Nikki Caravelli, who is an assistant planner at the Governor's Office for research and planning. Planning and research. Um, some of you may recognize Nikki from OPR's fantastic webinar series that they did over the winter and the spring, or if you've been following Sierra Camp's work for a while, you may recognize her as the former program lead for Sierra Camp. So welcome back, Nikki. We're thrilled to have you, and please take it away.
Thanks so much, Emily. And it's so great to be with familiar faces. Love to see this. Can everyone see my screen? Awesome. So hi, everyone. My name is Nikki Caravelli. I'm an assistant planner of climate resilience at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Today, I'll be covering SB 379, related legislation, and the California Adaptation Planning Guide. Just a real quick briefer on what I do at OPR. I support the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, which is really the state's statewide hub for coordinating climate resilience across local, regional, and state governments. There are two wings to this program, the Adaptation Clearinghouse and the Technical Advisory Council. And I manage the Adaptation Clearinghouse and also provide a lot of support translating the resources that we have at the state to help local planners and communities adapt to climate change. If you want to learn more about the program, feel free to check out our website and our impact report, which gives a little bit more detail on how we're steering the climate resilience ships, so to speak, across the state. So we already know this for the most part, that greenhouse gas mitigation combined with climate adaptation is what leads us to climate resilience. But there's been a lot more work in the planning space historically in California on greenhouse gas mitigation. A lot of folks in the room have probably been involved in an energy action plan in the Sierra Nevada region, potentially done in partnership with Sierra Business Council. You have energy inventories, greenhouse gas inventories. But the emerging field of climate adaptation has really picked up in the last few years in California, especially with new legislation requiring local governments to start considering climate hazards and climate risks in their existing planning efforts. And so that's what I'm going to be covering today. Just a refresher for folks, again, planners will know this inside and outside, but required elements of the general plan are listed on the left here. And then there's additional topical considerations, which I'll be touching on here today. I've highlighted some of the topics and required elements that I'm going to cover most as applicable to SB 379. So SB 379, nuts and bolts. So the basics of this bill, which passed in 2015, is that local jurisdictions are now required to update their safety element to address climate vulnerability and adaptation. This is triggered upon the next update to your local hazard mitigation plan, if you have one, on or after January 1st, 2017, or by January 1st, 2022, if you have not adopted a local hazard mitigation plan. In order to meet this requirement, instead of changing the entire safety element, you can choose to incorporate other plans by reference. For instance, you can update the local hazard mitigation plan with the vulnerability assessment and policies and reference it in a quick summary in the safety element. And that will qualify for meeting the SB 379 requirements. An update to this requirement was passed in 2018, SB 1035, which adds on the requirement to review and update flood, fire hazards, and climate adaptation portions of your safety element every 8 years, or upon the next housing element update. So here are this is what's a quick summary of what's in the code, but again, just legally, I would advise folks to make sure that they're really following what's in statute to make sure that you're all clear on the nuts and bolts there. But the main components are that jurisdictions will need to review their existing planning documents, complete a vulnerability assessment, develop adaptation strategies, policies, and goals, and develop feasible implementation measures, and then decide which and incorporate by reference or within the safety element, finalize it, and then adopt it formally. And now I want to bring in another requirement into the fold, SB 1000. So SB 1000 also adds an additional planning requirement, which comes into effect if you are adopting 2 or more elements concurrently, and your local agency contains disadvantaged communities as defined by this statute. Then you are required to create an environmental justice element or equivalent in your general plan. And so the reason why this is so important for considering as you're looking at SB 379 and 1035 is that there's a lot of overlap between the tasks here that you're required to do. So if you're looking at your SB 1000 disadvantaged communities, those same communities are likely gonna be very vulnerable to climate change. And so you're required to complete that vulnerability assessment as part of SB 379. So it may make sense for your jurisdiction to do this analysis all at one time. And so not only are you kind of condensing the workload and addressing multiple requirements, but there's a real opportunity here, aside from just checking the box of what's required, to also like truly advance equitable, climate resilient community planning, which I think all of us want to live in a climate resilient world, right? Ideally, that benefits all of us, including those that are most vulnerable to climate change. We have specific guidance on SB 1000 released last year, which you can check out on the OPR website. So I'm gonna hopefully not overwhelm folks with all of the legislation here that I'm covering, but I just want folks, I'm trying to connect the dots between how these are all related to climate resilience planning, or how you can address many of your existing priorities like wildfire resilience and environmental justice and equity and climate change. All of these things can be done all at once or within existing mechanisms that you may already be considering in your communities. So one of those, which is very likely, is that you're considering how do you address wildfire within your planning efforts. SB 1241 is the older requirement, which requires jurisdictions to consider wildfire resilience in state responsibility areas and very high fire hazard severity zones in local responsibility areas. And this is an update to the safety element upon the next housing element update on or after January 1st, 2014. And OPR has developed a specific wildfire hazard planning technical advisory. We are in the process of updating that guide, and we have a draft version that you can actually reference with much more comprehensive integrated guidance on how to take a look at wildfire, also in context with climate change. And so that's on our website. I won't be covering that in detail, mostly because it's not finalized yet. We still have to get it approved by the governor's office. But once it is finalized, maybe we can host another workshop and we can cover the guidance in detail, because I know that's a topic of huge interest here. A couple other things to keep in mind: AB 747, SB 99. These were passed 2 years ago. Upon the next revision of your local hazard mitigation plan, address in your safety element evacuation routes and their capacity, safety, and viability under a range of emergency scenarios, such as a climate disaster. And then SB 99, identify residential developments in hazard areas that do not have at least 2 emergency evacuation routes. And this is upon the next revision of the housing element on or after January 1st, 2020. And so through all of these, you can kind of get a sense that the state really wants communities to be considering climate risk holistically throughout all of their planning documents and align them. And we understand that this is a huge challenge for many folks. There's a lot of conflicting deadlines and things. And so we're here to help. I just want to offer that. And we are doing our best to provide guidance. So I'll give an overview of some of the potential pathways for how you might consider all of these. And again, I think integrating all of these different requirements at once is probably going to be the most efficient and effective path forward. But ultimately, that'll be up to your jurisdiction and some of the specific conditions, which I've kind of laid out here on the screen. So as you're considering all of these different things for addressing climate resilience in your planning, you might want to consider when is your next housing element update. That might be the most hard and fast deadline because it has such teeth in terms of who regulates it. It's the only element really required to be updated and regulated by the Housing and Community Development Department. So that might really dictate what your process is. The next hard and fast deadline might be your LHMP update. Oops, excuse me. Your local hazard mitigation plan, if you have one. And we know that that is potentially important because it gives you access to funding through the State Office of Emergency Services if you have an updated LHMP. And that could be important for the next wildfire disaster. Thirdly, any community engagement processes that you're currently or considering in the future might dictate how you do this. Anticipated CEQA stuff, your internal capacity, priorities, and funding, and your elected officials, and then the compliance requirements and the legal risk determined by your local agency. And so I can't actually tell you like exactly what you must do. Ultimately, you have to rely on your legal advice for the best path forward here. A couple of ways that we have seen jurisdictions across the state address this. Here's the cascading updates pathway, where again, if that housing element is like the first thing on the line, maybe you do that first, and then you update your safety element and environmental justice element. And that just kind of follows, the sort of regulatory triggers where housing is maybe the most important one. And then because there's those requirements and ties to housing for some of those regulations, you do the safety element, and then now you're updating 2 or more elements at the same time. So then you do your environmental justice element. Second potential pathway, doing them all at once. This might be really effective for you if you're doing all of your analyses and updating them all at the same time. Again, may not be feasible for all jurisdictions. And then this one, I think this one's interesting in that it kind of nests a lot of the work that's required. So if you were to do your environmental justice update first, you're doing the disadvantaged communities and outreach for that, which could ultimately inform your vulnerability analysis and your climate adaptation strategy. And plus that can feed into your housing assessment and your RENA requirements and whatnot. So a couple of different approaches to consider. And again, we have a couple of different guidelines here that are all designed to help folks meet these requirements. We will be developing guidelines for the newer ones, I think is SB 99 and AB 747 over the next year or two. So look out for those. I'm sorry, we do not have any guidance on them at the moment, but it's coming. And I know that Emily and folks are probably going to cover the Adaptation Clearinghouse, but I manage the State Adaptation Clearinghouse, and so I want to offer that we are a resource for you all, and there's a lot of examples here of different communities across the state, tools and data, case studies, example plans and projects. One resource in particular that I want to highlight is the Resilient CA Adaptation Planning Map, or RAP map for short, which basically just kind of takes a look at the different planning documents of jurisdictions across California and organizes them based on what activities they completed, whether it's a vulnerability assessment or adaptation policies or a safety element update, and assigns them a color code. And then you can click on each jurisdiction and access those planning documents to see what they did. This is not meant to indicate compliance with any of the regulations that I've already outlined. This is just a tool to kind of inventory different adaptation activities across the state and be a publicly accessible tool to help folks kind of, decide how they want to move forward with adaptation planning and give us a picture of where we need to direct resources to meet our adaptation goals. I'm gonna pause for a sec and get a glass of water. And I've seen a couple things pop up in the chat, so I just want to make sure none of that's directed at me at the moment.
We've got one question for you, Nikki. Would you want to take it now as you're going through, or would you prefer to save it for the end? One question.
I'll take it now. Yeah.
Okay, great. So this question comes from Clay Downing. And it is, with respect to the pathways used to address the EJ, LHMP, and housing issues, have you been seeing cities and counties approach the work differently from one another, or large urban communities different from rural communities?
Yeah, I think with respect to, I think it varies by region. Each region receives their RENA numbers, I think, on a different timeline. And I'm not really as much of an expert on the housing policy and housing elements. So I have a few gaps in my knowledge there. But for instance, the Bay might have updated their housing elements already for the most recent RENA cycle, but the southern region might still not have received their number. I don't know exactly how it works, but I think that timeline with how HCD has oriented our RENA allocations has really shaped a lot of this more than anything, rather than like distinctions between urban and rural, as well as the LHMP kind of tie to receiving funding. At least that's kind of what we've seen. And I think this concept of doing the safety and housing element concurrently is definitely potentially newer. A couple of different jurisdictions we've seen: Mammoth Lakes, Marin County. Those are a couple that have kind of tried to address both of those simultaneously. If you know other examples, send them over. We'd be interested to know.
Great. And we have one more question about fire hazard guidelines from OPR. Let's go ahead and have you continue your presentation, if that sounds good to you. Okay, and then we'll address that one at the end.
Okay, so I'm just going to cover the 2020 Adaptation Planning Guide now, which is an update from the original 2012 version. If you have been around and seen the 2012 version, that was 4 separate documents to guide adaptation planning for local communities. The new update now follows a linear roadmap of a 4-phased process, with outreach and engagement integrated into each of these phases. So Phase 1, exploring, defining, and initiating. Phase 2, assessing vulnerability. Phase 3, defining your adaptation framework and strategies. And Phase 4, implementing, monitoring, evaluating, and adjusting. Oops. I don't know what happened here. Okay. So Phase 1, the first one is all about scoping and kicking off your process, making sure that planners are fully prepared for an adaptation effort and that you really know what you're getting into before starting it. And there are 4 steps in this initial phase. The first step, motivation and scope, is about confirming why you're undertaking these adaptation efforts, what you hope to get out of it, what the broad parameters are. The second step is about your teams and resources, ensuring that you have the right people involved, the participants have all the resources they need. The third step is choosing the climate effects and populations and assets that you want to analyze in your adaptation plan, which is really setting up the technical analysis that will follow in later phases. And then, of course, beginning your outreach and engagement. And this is a critical component that should really be an ongoing effort, not only throughout this phase, but through all of the processes of planning for climate change. So really setting up a strong framework for engaging your community. So just a quick summary about some of the content in here. It's all about making sure that the community's adaptation efforts have a clear foundation, a clear goals and vision, a solid work group, and other aspects of a framework before your in-depth work begins. And this can really help ensure that your efforts are comprehensive and holistic from the beginning, and that you're able to conduct it a little bit more efficiently and on time. These are some of the key questions that we hope Phase 1 will help communities answer. And these questions are designed to help planners think about some of the big vision-related aspects of adaptation planning, as well as some of the logistics of the process, such as the budget and who should be involved. And then finally, going back to that outreach and engagement, plan. This can include a core project team with a mix of representatives from various departments, CBOs, public institutions, hospitals, colleges, utility companies, major employers, ski resorts, etc. This phase also provides recommendations here in this step for establishing and using public-private partnerships, such as Sierra Camp, I might note, and stakeholder mapping to ensure an equitable outreach process. It's making sure that the communities who aren't traditionally in the room are engaged. One important aspect to consider, if you haven't seen it already, I'm sure a lot of planners here have seen this, is the public participation spectrum, and considering how you might move along this spectrum, moving towards the collaborate and empower part of the spectrum. And this step is really, again, to identify persons and frontline communities who might be most vulnerable to climate change and ensuring that you're involving them in the planning process, in the distribution of resources that might come out of this process, etc. So the next phase, and I'm not going to go into phase 3 and 4, I'm just covering the initial phases here. But the second phase is the vulnerability assessment. And there are several sub-steps in this page, or in this phase, excuse me. So as you're conducting a vulnerability assessment, you'll confirm through the data analysis and community outreach that the climate-related effects that are of concern and assess how those effects may change. And you'll also be affirming in this step which populations and assets may be vulnerable to climate change, and actually assessing how these groups and resources may be impacted through climate projection modeling, looking at the data, doing the workshops, inviting folks to discuss their experience with climate resilience and the impacts. The third step within this phase is assessing adaptive capacity and, what are your existing strengths? What can you build on? The fourth step, the scoring, is about bringing together all of those previous 3 steps and assigning a vulnerability score to the different assets and populations and things. As with the first phase, community engagement and outreach runs throughout the entire phase. And there's a ton of guidance in here on how to do that. So just to summarize, the vulnerability assessment is the major technical analysis that really supports the overall adaptation planning effort. And just to kind of connect this piece back to integrating planning throughout multiple different planning mechanisms, the vulnerability assessment can really inform a ton of your priorities, whether it's a local hazard mitigation plan or the safety element, or a specific climate hazard like wildfire, or your capital improvement plan or SB 1000. The vulnerability assessment is really the nuts and bolts of where you're figuring out where your priorities are. And so this step is so critical. And I think that's probably why Sierra Camp is really focusing on a regional vulnerability assessment, because it's really important to do this right for equity reasons and to make sure that we are adapting, not maladapting, as we say. And of course, a key priority in the guidance as it was being developed is that it will help local jurisdictions meet the SB 379 requirements. And so here's a couple of different questions. Sorry, I was just following my notes here, that are meant to kind of guide you as you're exploring the different steps. And then outreach and engagement within this step is really to identify, again, neighborhood strengths, your assets, climate change effects. And there's a couple of different activities that you can do to achieve this, such as stakeholder interviews, tapping into local knowledge, storytelling timelines, providing a historical hazard inventory through different narratives. The third activity is participatory asset mapping, and then finally community-based participatory research, which might look like partnering with academic institutions or nonprofit organizations or tribes to conduct some research. So the last thing I'll touch on here is what are vulnerable communities? I think there have been some challenges that we've seen across the state in figuring out exactly what this is, because it's so context dependent and really relies on a lot of underlying structural societal factors in the context of climate adaptation. So our Technical Advisory Council, as part of the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program over at OPR, developed a definition of vulnerable communities that we hope will be helpful to you to guide your process. And I'm not going to read this definition up on the screen here, but we developed a guidebook. Sorry, just going through here real quick. Don't want to take up too much time, but we've developed a guidebook kind of covering these root causes of vulnerability, the different indicators, societal and demographic factors, et cetera, that might lead to vulnerability. And so this summary includes a crosswalk with the indicators that are required elements of an SB 1000 analysis, so you can align that with your vulnerability assessment. Additional indicators that could be used to assess underlying vulnerability on a case-by-case basis, a list of different process guides that can help in this step, and different tools to evaluate climate risk. And then also tools to evaluate adaptive capacity, such as Cal Screen, Healthy Places Index, and the Regional Opportunities Index. And just a final note that we're currently working on a platform for helping communities define and identify vulnerable communities. So stay tuned. We'll have an extensive statewide public outreach process for building out this tool, which will integrate some of the tools laid out in the guide, such as Cal Screen and the Regional Opportunities Index and all these other kind of decision support tools and data that are out there. It's really meant to combine them and integrate them into a holistic platform that is much more easy to use as a decision-making platform and prioritize your actions and strategies based on vulnerability. So stay tuned for more information on that. Whew. So I know that was a lot. Happy to answer questions. And please do sign up for our newsletter. We send out a lot of resources for planning. We host webinars and workshops, working on the state adaptation strategy right now if you want to get involved in that. So lots of updates. Follow our newsletter for that.
Amazing. Thank you, Nikki. So much valuable information in there. We really appreciate it. I wanted to touch on this question from Amy Augustine in the chat. Amy, thank you for your patience. Will OPR fire hazard guidelines coordinate the requirements of the state minimum fire safe regulations of 2021?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question, mostly because I wasn't a part of the team developing the guidelines, but I think we will be hosting a workshop as soon as those guidelines are finalized, which will hopefully be the best opportunity for those types of questions to be answered. And again, there's the draft version online, which I can share in the chat in a little bit when I get off the screen here, so you can reference that as well.
Nikki, just one question real quick. I'm hoping that you will be able to share your slides with registrants when we send out the recording, because obviously this is a wealth of super valuable information and an incredible reference. So
absolutely, the slides will be shared.
Stay tuned for that, folks. I know I'll be going back to look at this again. Any other questions from folks?
I think while folks are thinking, I'll just add that, you know, there can be a sense that, oh my God, there's all these deadlines approaching, everything's like stacked on top of each other, there's so many requirements. Hopefully you've gotten a sense that a lot of this can just be achieved all at once, hopefully in a more efficient manner if you tackle it all at once. But also, I think, you know, if you're trying to do your best to meet these requirements, you know, OPR doesn't have regulatory authority. No other agency has regulatory authority. And so, you know, we're not going to come down smack you or something for not meeting the deadlines here. I mean, the goal is just to help us all begin to move forward on addressing climate resilience and addressing these real hazards with the reality that it's changing, that we can't rely on what we've done in the past. And so even if you're not able to make it in the timeline, if you're getting started, that's okay. Give your best faith effort, and we're here to help along the way.
It looks like we have one more question, Nikki. In budget discussions, there's been some funding, potential funding for OPR to support jurisdictions doing their climate adaptation planning. Obviously, nothing's set in stone yet, but from OPR's perspective, are you able to say anything about how those future funding opportunities might be tied to SB 379 or any of these other statutory requirements that you mentioned?
Yeah, so you may have seen the governor's May revised proposal did include climate adaptation planning grants that could be used at a regional or local basis. And I think the budget process is still ongoing. Unfortunately, we won't know the nuts and bolts for our proposals that we had in the governor's budget for a while as that kind of evolves. But based on what the legislature and governor's office released the other day, there is an approved or semi-approved, I should say, portion of the transportation budget dedicated to adaptation planning. So it looks like there will be some transportation related stuff. I know that funding in the previous rounds was really critical to getting Mammoth Lakes and Truckee's adaptation planning efforts going. Hopefully we'll see additional funding for climate adaptation planning and resilience in the coming weeks. But unfortunately, I can't say any more on that.
Fair enough. Thank you. So I think not seeing any further questions for Nikki, we're going to transition to the second part of our webinar today, which is our panel discussion. So panelists, feel free to turn on your cameras. Just in the interest of time, we did have one more slide on some of the resources, adaptation planning resources that Nikki mentioned, which are actually up on our website. It's kind of the best of the best for adaptation planning resources. There we go. And so I'm just gonna, instead of walking through those, just in the interest of time, I'm gonna put the link in the chat. And if you're unsure of what resources to look at first, excuse me, frog in my throat. This is where you should start, and this lives on our website, so you can peruse at your leisure. But without further ado, let's transition into the panel discussion with representatives from 3 different jurisdictions that are in different stages of their climate adaptation planning processes and have used different approaches. So we're going to take that information that Nikki shared and then get a sense, hopefully, of what that looks like on the ground, doing the work in real life. So we are very happy to be joined for this part of our webinar by Erica Mertens, a program manager with the town of Truckee, Tracey Ferguson, the planning director with Plumas County, Quincy Yaley, the director of the community development department with Tuolumne County, and then Claire Kasinadhuni, a Civic Spark Fellow with Sierra Business Council, who has been working on behalf of Plumas County. So welcome all of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great, and to dive right into this panel discussion, we're going to start off with a pretty broad one. So where are each of you in your climate adaptation planning process? How did you decide which strategy to use for pursuing SB 379 compliance? And then to dive a little deeper, how did you decide whether or not to combine multiple planning topics or priorities into your adaptation planning effort? So let's go ahead and just go around our little grid here. First up on mine is Tracey with Plumas County.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hear me okay? Okay, great. Hi, Tracey Ferguson. Yes, Plumas County Planning Director. Quick note about me. I've been the Director of Planning here in Plumas for about 2 years. So newer to the director role and getting to know Plumas County. And yes, Claire, thankfully, has helped us out on behalf of Sierra Business Council as a Civic Spark AmeriCorps Fellow. So Claire will help me in a lot of my conversation today about Plumas County and what we're doing to address SB 379. But we had a 2014 local hazard mitigation plan. And so the triggers here, we recently initiated last fall, so October, or maybe last year. So January of 2020, we started our local hazard mitigation plan update. So in that regard, that update triggering SB 379. And then, you know, we completed that process last October 2020. So we have a very robust and FEMA, almost FEMA approved. So through Cal OES, through FEMA, that our local hazard mitigation plan meeting all regulatory requirements. So we're at the very end stages. Actually, the board just adopted the plan yesterday, and it's back to FEMA for final adoption. So hooray on that local hazard mitigation plan process. So last October 2020, Claire, I looked that up, was our kickoff for then the vulnerability assessment and SB 379, you know, climate change project. So looking at then, you know, our process and how we're planning through the local hazard mitigation plan, which has, you know, a lot of components of the information that we need, but not all of them necessarily packaged in the correct way as to the SB 379 legislation and, you know, what all is in there. So deciding to pursue, you know, the SB 379 compliance through the vulnerability assessment process, and then looking at our hazard mitigation plan to see what we can incorporate by reference into the safety element because it's in the local hazard mitigation plan, or what we have to actually change with goals, policies, objectives, implementation measures in the safety element. So I think our approach is a bit of a hybrid, but Nikki, I really appreciated your comments on, you know, the vulnerability assessment as that technical analysis and component. And I think for Plumas County, without doing the VA work to set the baseline with climate adaptation in the context of, you know, vulnerability assessment and informing then the climate priorities and so forth, because that side of the legislation wasn't necessarily in our local hazard mitigation plan. So, you know, we threaded climate change throughout our hazard mitigation plan. I mean, it is a hazard, and it is a hazard amongst the other hazards as well. So it's there. I think, again, we just have to kind of parse it out and see how it applies to SB 379 and do a hybrid approach. And then I think how we decided to combine multiple planning topics and priorities, maybe kicking that over to Claire. You know, within the vulnerability assessment, I think, you know, when we looked at what are hazards in the local hazard mitigation plan and exposures in the vulnerability assessment, we did see a lot of alignment, of course, because in Plumas County, you know, I mean, wildfire certainly, and flooding, severe weather. Tree mortality is something, you know, that may be different in other jurisdictions. You know, we have, you know, 75% forest, and so it's important to look at our tree health, our forest health. So that was a different, as far as an exposure that then turned into, or excuse me, a hazard in the local hazard mitigation plan that then turned into exposure. So, and then drought, of course, and decreased snowpack. So being up, you know, Mountain County, looking at decreased snowpack for a climate vulnerability exposure, whereas the local hazard mitigation plan, we looked at, you know, severe weather and so forth. So that wasn't specifically stated. Anything else to add, Claire, on that one? Okay. Thanks.
Definitely, thank you. Quincy?
Hi, good afternoon. Quincy Yaley with Tuolumne County Community Development Department. We are getting ready to publish our draft climate action plan / vulnerability assessment. this summer, hopefully in July. And we adopted our climate change element of our general plan in January of 2019 when we updated our comprehensive general plan. We had to update our housing element in the fall of 2019. And so we updated the housing element again and the safety element again in the fall of 2019, working with CAL FIRE and the Board of Forestry on things like communities with only one point of access and other requirements that we had to deal with. We started our climate action plan process in 2019. It was a settlement requirement out of our Tuolumne County General Plan to be completed by December of 2019. We're not done yet. And so we hope that we will finish that this year. We started out as a climate action plan with Ascent Environmental, who provided an optional task of a vulnerability assessment. I didn't know what that was, and so I said, we don't need that. And once we started down the process, it became pretty clear that that's really mostly what our community cared about. They weren't really worried about greenhouse gas emissions for the sake of greenhouse gas emissions. They were worried about threats to the community, such as vulnerabilities. And so it was sometime during that process in probably 2020 that we really started down the vulnerability assessment road, which has totally overtaken our process. So we have a combined climate action plan vulnerability assessment that we are working on here at the county that we hope to have approved, or hope to have it to the board, I should say, this summer. Thanks.
Thank you. And Erica, let's hear from you.
Yeah, thanks so much. My name is Erica Mertens, and I oversee our Keep Truckee Green programs for the town of Truckee, which are our sustainability, resiliency, and solid waste programs. And I'll go ahead and just caveat by saying I was not the program lead on this project, although I was involved in much of the outreach and some of the stakeholder engagement. But really, this work is credited to two staff who are no longer at the town. That's Nick Martin and Aaron Ronald, and also actually Jillian Greenberg, who was a Civic Spark Fellow. So I'll do my best to give the full breadth of background, but just wanted to make it known that this shouldn't be credited to me. We did a lot of work to complete a vulnerability assessment starting in 2019 and completed everything in 2020. And we utilized the GEOS Institute for their whole communities approach at vulnerability assessment and also climate adaptation plan. So we're currently in the midst of a general plan update as well. So that's our Truckee 2040. And we're currently working on having a climate action element and also integrating everything into the safety element as well. So that has been an interesting process to be involved in peripherally as a non-planner, and also to just understand how we get from the vulnerability assessment, an adaptation plan, and actually into our general plan itself. So definitely a different stage, it sounds like, a little bit than the other folks, but many lessons learned along the way.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Tracey and Quincy as well. It's so fascinating for me to hear the kind of variation in all your processes and how the puzzle pieces fit together. And there's really no one size fits all approach. It's what your community is interested. So fascinating, Quincy, that Tuolumne County residents were really motivated by the vulnerability assessment. And it's a local process, and so there's going to be a lot of variation. Continuing a little bit here on the nuts and bolts, very much on the nuts and bolts. I think, a major question for a lot of jurisdictions, especially in our region, which maybe doesn't have the financial resources some of the bigger cities and counties in California is funding, and how you have funded your climate action plan or vulnerability assessment or adaptation, climate adaptation planning process. So let's just go in reverse order and start with you, Erica.
Sure, thanks for that question. We were fortunate to have some grant funding through SB1 through a Caltrans grant. And that's largely how we did the funding for GEOS Institute. They did a tremendous amount of work for the community workshops and stakeholder workshops and getting that plan together. We also are really fortunate that our most recent elected council sets have been very focused on sustainability. So that is something that has been prioritized at the town of Truckee and has also been prioritized in funding that source. So I actually think 2019 might have been the first year that we had a designated fund for sustainability earmarked within our budget. Either 2018 or 2019 was the first year that we had that. And so while we don't have a designated sustainability department, we did set up some funding for activities such as this and other outreach.
Great, thank you. Quincy, you want to chime in?
Sure. So we funded all of ours through the general fund. It costs, I'm looking at the contract, about $150,000. Hoping that because of the work that the vulnerability assessment and the climate action plan are doing, that will make future updates that we might have hired consultants to do less cumbersome, such as our local hazard mitigation plan, other general plan updates. So hoping to leverage that. But as I said, this was a settlement issue in our lawsuit. So there was no choice. So yeah, it was all general fund.
Great, thank you. And then Tracey and Claire, maybe, if you want to chime in.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah, I'll have Claire talk about Civic Spark and the fellow. And so Plumas County, through the Office of Emergency Services, long time has received a Cal OES grant for the local hazard mitigation plan. So that was great that we did have a consultant actually on board for the local hazard mitigation plan process. So I think that's why our plan is so terrific and working with them. And then looking to address the safety element items, I did attempt a CAL FIRE planning grant, which I was denied. That was last year. CAL FIRE was looking more to, address fuels reduction and real projects on the ground with fuels management. So I was told a lot of the planning projects just were denied. And I know there was another round here come May, which I didn't apply for, but, I think in future, when I look to the safety element update, which, will be next year, to look to CAL FIRE to see if those planning grants will come back around for the safety element. In particular, I think, the 1241, I think it was tied more to the 1241 in the wildfire, but, kind of doing everything at once is attractive to me as far as that goes. So wanting to wrap everything in. I also went for a California Resilience Challenge grant. I don't know if some of you were familiar with that. That was back in spring of 2020, denied on that one too. So I've gone for grants. I think I still will go for grants. But otherwise, yeah, general fund, Quincy, I hear you, and really staff time. So it's more staff time, general fund, that is, my time. And then thankfully, because we don't really have extra funds to hire consultants for this purpose, being, just our county general fund is very constricted. And so Sarah Business Council, thankfully, y'all approached Plumas County to see if we would be, interested in partnering with a Civic Spark Fellow through AmeriCorps to prepare the vulnerability assessment. So I took that great news to the board. That was August of 2020. So, and then, yeah, we all, yeah, made it work and met Claire and kicked off, as I said, in October. And so I think, it's like having a consultant, really. And with you all and Sierra Business Council being, at the forefront of climate adaptation and Sierra Camp and so forth, it's made all the difference for us as far as in education and awareness and being able to really tackle this, climate adaptation and vulnerability assessment task with you all as experts. And, Claire's been terrific, being a Civic Spark Fellow and, coming into the profession and so forth, so knowledgeable and so forth. So that pro bono, basically, labor has been really great. So Claire, you want to speak to your experience in Civic Spark?
Sure, I can just say a few things about the program in general. I know that Butte County has also used a Civic Spark Fellow to go about writing their climate vulnerability assessment. So I think it's a route that other jurisdictions have taken as well. But the program, like Tracey mentioned, is an AmeriCorps sister program. It's under AmeriCorps, but it's separate. It's only in the state of California, working to increase local government capacity addressing climate issues. So I think it's like a great opportunity because there's simultaneously helping like young professionals get experience in the field and then also increasing capacity for capacity constrained governments. So I've had a wonderful experience so far, and I'm excited to kind of wrap up the program. And I think Nikki also put a link down in the chat box.
Claire, do you want to
Nikki, so there's going to be another California Resilience Challenge RFP released. Okay, good to know.
Claire, do you want to just touch really briefly on how you and Tracey have worked together and kind of the relationship that you have, working with SBC, but also working kind of directly on behalf of Plumas County?
Yeah, so the program is kind of complicated to explain, but because I'm housed in a nonprofit, Sierra Business Council, I have like external government beneficiaries. So Plumas County is my government beneficiary. So I've been working on writing the vulnerability assessment, and then Tracey and I meet like bi-weekly and discuss components and talk about different pieces of it. So it's like definitely like a partnership on the project. I'm not doing it all myself. And I'm also, I think we'll get into it later, but using a lot of resources that are already available. So I'm not creating the wheel or recreating the wheel, yeah. But yeah, it's been a great experience. And did I touch on everything? Is there anything else? Okay.
Yeah, I'd love, Claire, if you want to just roll right into sharing those resources that you just mentioned.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, so Nikki, I think, touched a little bit on some of these, and then also Emily showed the slide that will be on Sierra Camp's website with other resources, and those definitely apply to my list. But first is the adaptation planning guide that has been just the, like the guideline for this project, and also is more or less a template that gives you step-by-step instructions on how to go about the process. But then to kind of supplement that structure and framework, I've also relied a lot on case studies. So other jurisdictions, vulnerability assessments, or climate action plans that have structures. And then also you can kind of look and see how other people have chosen to, target populations or assets. And so some of those for me have been the Mammoth Lakes vulnerability assessment, as well as the Resilient LA vulnerability assessment and the Town of Truckee vulnerability assessment. And those are all very different jurisdictions. So it's not really the information included in them, but it's more about like the structure and the way that they've laid out their information has been really helpful. And then a few others that have been so important is the 4th climate change assessment. So that it's broken out regionally, and then there's one overall report. And so I have relied a lot on the Sierra Nevada regional assessment specifically, and then also the larger California one. And then also I can definitely leave my email in the chat if anybody wants suggestions on resources. I can send some your way. But definitely the Safeguarding California Plan, the 2018 update, And I think Tracey just mentioned that they are working on re-updating that soon. So they're in the process of doing that. But that is the most up-to-date one as of now. As well as the California Department of Public Health, I think with UC Davis, does these individual county climate change and health profiles. So you can look up specifically your county and then download a report that's specific to your county. And I've relied on that quite a bit because it's just kind of a sourcing of a lot of different components, and it's really helpful to have those all in one place. So I've definitely relied on that. As well as the OPR general plan guidelines, the adaptation clearinghouse that Nikki mentioned. And then also more kind of on the data side is like CalAdapt, obviously, and CAL FIRE. They have a lot of great maps and other tables that you can utilize. But I would say just starting out with kind of those larger framework documents and resources is great because it can get so overwhelming when you start looking for resources. There's truly endless things out there. So yeah, so definitely starting out creating a general framework with the APG, which is that adaptation planning guide, as well as using case studies is definitely what I recommend. But yeah, those are some that I've relied on. And I don't know, Tracey, if you have any that you want to add.
Yeah, I think that's totally great advice. When the APG is really the, where there's a lot of examples and so forth. So in that 4-phase process, that first phase of explore. So I feel like that's the exploring. It's like, what are my options? What have other people done? What's best practice? And, and then pare down basically to your jurisdiction, because that's what the APG is all about. It's like, here's a laundry list of things that could apply to your community and populations, environment, the built environment, but what's specific to you. So then we took the macro and made it more micro. And then that's that defining. So you're exploring, then you're defining, and then you're initiating, right? So that first phase is super important to really take in that big picture and understand those resources, and but then tailor to your community.
That's a fantastic overview. Thank you. And for those who may not have seen, I put some links of the resources that Claire was referring to in the chat, and Nikki added some as well. So thanks for doing that, Nikki. Quincy or Erica, anything that you want to add on the subject of kind of key resources? If not, we can just keep rolling ahead. Okay. I think one other question that was highlighted in everyone's overview is the stakeholder engagement process. I know Nikki emphasized the importance of that, and I think all of you mentioned it in kind of your description of your work. Maybe Erica, starting with you, can you tell us a little bit about the stakeholder engagement and outreach process that Truckee used, and what it looked like and how it went?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have definitely a focus on stakeholder engagement in Truckee. That's kind of part of our ethos, is having a very much community-driven process. And we pride ourselves on the Truckee way. That's kind of what we call it, basically. And we had a series of stakeholder workshops as well as public workshops. So first we formed a task force, and that was both, we had a task force for our vulnerability assessment as well as for the climate adaptation plan. So we sort of had like two parts working in tandem during 2019 and 2020. And the stakeholder workshops gathered 35 stakeholders, so 35 attendees, and that represented many different agencies and nonprofits in the area, and that was representing 5 different sectors. So the natural, built, economic, human, and cultural. So representatives from all 5 of those. And in the first part of that workshop. They were basically all day workshops. They were pretty intensive. And the first workshop was based around identifying the vulnerabilities that we have in Truckee. And then we had a second day workshop that basically followed up on that in identifying solutions. Kind of mirroring that, we also did public workshops. So we had 2 public workshops, again, very similar. The first one based on kind of setting the stage and identifying the vulnerabilities. And then the second one, we broke the community members into small groups, and we had different facilitators and had more engaged small group discussions. So I would say in large, they were pretty successful. But one component that I think we're still always working to improve is our really looking at the equitable outreach and particularly engaging our Latinx population. So we have about 30% Spanish speaking population in Truckee. So, or did I misquote that number? Maybe someone else. And I'm feeling a late afternoon fatigue, so pardon, but I think it's 30%. And we definitely, oh, I think it is closer to 20%. Thank you, Emily. As soon as the number came out of my mouth, I was like, that seems really high. But we did a series of surveys in addition to those public workshops, and we did some targeted outreach in Spanish as well, but I think we could always do a better job. And I think that's just like one reflection is figuring out how to kind of reframe the issue in a way that makes it matter to people. So whatever it is in your community that is really going to drive that engagement, not everyone is going to be interested in a climate ready Truckee workshop, but someone might be interested in if the word wildfire preparedness is, in the heading. And so really just being smart in how you frame the issues and trying to appeal to the audiences that you're trying to engage, basically.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that everyone's got their priorities. And so we need to be able to speak to those in these outreach processes. Speaking of which, Quincy, sounds like the residents of Tuolumne County made it pretty clear that they have priorities. Do you mind sharing a bit about that experience? And
sorry if my face is getting redder and redder. It is so hot in my office right now.
Oh, like no.
100 degrees outside, and Amy Augustine, I see she's on the call. She knows it's blazing in here right now. So I apologize that I look like a tomato.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's so hot. That's brutal.
Turn the fan on and it would be too loud. And we don't have AC. Okay, so I'm actually pretty jazzed about our public engagement process. And when we hired Ascent, we hired, along with, one of the reasons we hired was they brought Kearns and West with them, who handles all of our public outreach. I have never been more impressed on how prepared this team is for a public meeting. We rehearse, we log on early and rehearse. We have whole entire side teams meetings set up where we're coordinating with each other during the process. They've knocked my socks off in terms of the participants on our consultant team who aren't climate experts. They're public outreach experts. So I just, if you're able to bring in a team like that to help you, that was something that we looked for, because we didn't have any staff capacity to create new pathways, new committees, new task forces, no new anything. I was going to stick with what we have already existing. So we did a series of using our board committees as our testing grounds. We would go to the Natural Resources Committee, then we would go to our Planning Committee. So I've got four board members right in between there. And then we would have a public workshop, and we did that 3 times. We were ready to go out for public input in the fall of last year. Then we had an election here locally, which changed dramatically the makeup of our Board of Supervisors. So we decided to wait. And so we waited until after the new board members came in so that we didn't have to start over, because it was just going to be so close. It was like in November, December, and it was just like, we're going to wait till January. So we delayed our schedule to make sure that we were going to have a consistent, at least, board through the public workshops and the adoption of the process. We broke our public workshops into 3 categories. The first set of meetings was about emissions and emissions inventories. Then the next one was about adaptation strategies. And the last one was about mitigation measures that could be implemented on development projects. And the consultants would give me the information prior to it and I would comment on it. But I made a very conscious effort not to veto anything that they gave me, because it was really important that this is public driven. And so even the crazy ideas that I knew the Board of Supervisors would probably not want to adopt, I left those in those so that the public could either yay or nay those. And then once we got to the board, the document is just facilitated by me. It's not my document at all. We had, in our first workshop, we had over 80 attendees, which was, I couldn't believe it, super jazzed. They included special districts, interested members of the public, planning commissioners, board members, and then real estate agents and developers. And we had the timber industry was present. And then we also, our tribes have been really engaged in this process as well. And then the last thing I'll just add is the consultant team is using a platform called Conveyo, KONV.io. And I've really been excited about the way that the public can interact and comment on documents in a really live way, without just like sending a comment letter in that's separate from your ordinance or your policies or anything like that. So we used Conveyo, which I had never heard of. And so, it's a lot of money, but in a small community like ours, I just didn't have the expertise or the knowledge or the capacity to take on the project. So we've had a fairly robust public outreach process.
Excellent, Quincy, that sets me up really well for our next question, which, I think in some ways is the elephant in the room, and that's local government capacity can often be a significant barrier to doing climate planning work, especially at small governments in our region, and where there often are only 1 or 2 planners, if that. And we're wondering, for everyone, how did you manage your capacity limitations? And I think let's go ahead and kick it off with Tracey. Quincy, I feel like we all of you might be able to weigh in. Let's start with Tracey.
Yeah, and I think in addressing this already, I mean, having Sierra Business Council and Claire on board as a Civic Spark Fellow is how we address the capacity constraints. And then as well, I'm a department head, coordinating with other department heads. So across, public works and building and, so forth. I mean, all the departments which are affected. So spreading sort of the workload amongst other department staff and making this one county collaborative process, as well our, robust stakeholders. And through the hazard mitigation plan process, we established a hazard mitigation, planning group, which included both, county employees and stakeholders. And in Plumas, I had a list of 200 plus, on the stakeholders, because we state, federal, local, special districts, so a lot of our stakeholder group are really smart, informed, active folks. So, yep.
For our capacity, the way we address this is it took longer. We were supposed to be done in 2019, and we'll finish at the end of 21. So that and also it was a lack of knowledge on my end about what a climate action plan process looked like, and so I also maybe wasn't clear in understanding how long it was really going to take. One thing that was paramount to the success of this project is that the consultants sat me down every 2 weeks and we had a meeting. If they hadn't put that into the budget and I'm the only person on our team, in our staff, that's working on this. if they hadn't done that, then we would never have made any progress because it would have been out of sight, out of mind. Amy asked what surprises from the process and what was and wasn't accepted. Just two short things. One is just the ease of technology in our public, because we did this all through COVID. You know, it's like some of you all did. So all of our workshops were online, and the consultants used a lot of polls in the process, but the polling was built in through your cell phone, so you had to download a link, and then you could be a part of the polling for that. And so that sort of tripped some people up. So if there would have been a way to do different kinds of polling in the process, I think that would have been easier. And then what wasn't accepted, just as a little squirrel, was when we did I told the team this yesterday, we have been we've been discussing the role of wildfire in our climate action plan consistently. That's all the public wants to talk about. And we've said, no, the climate action plan is about policies and procedures that the county can enforce, that we can shape, that we can mold, mitigation measures and all this kind of stuff. And they just didn't want to hear it. And so we finally did just sort of give in. And that's why we have this sort of joint vulnerability assessment and climate action plan in a response to the fact that the public, they weren't really into like the emissions. They were to a small extent, but that wasn't what they wanted to talk about. They wanted to talk about wildfire. Thank you.
Definitely. Erica, Claire, did you have additional thoughts on capacity challenges?
Yeah, I would just echo what Tracey mentioned as well. We also had Civic Spark Fellows on our staff during that time. And for anyone who has been interested and not done the program, I couldn't recommend it more strongly. The caliber of candidates that you receive is extremely high. And I think no matter who you end up with, you will always find a very smart, capable, driven, often younger professional. And so I think that has been a huge asset for our team, because again, we have a small squad that we're working with as well. The other thing I'll say is that we formed a sustainability committee within the town of Truckee. So it's an internal committee made up of nearly one person from every division, but certainly every department. And so that has been one way that we've been able to have somewhat of an ad hoc sustainability department, and we meet monthly. But also just helps to have crossover for outreach purposes. At the time when we were doing one of the climate workshops, we were also doing some solid waste reduction, foodware ordinance workshops. So we were able to kind of leverage that as like a workshop series and really just drive more attention to the workshops that we were holding.
Great. Before we move on to our next question, I just wanted to direct the audience's attention to the Q&A. We have plenty of more questions for our panelists, but we wanted to make sure as the clock starts to tick down, that if there's anything in particular any of you wanted to touch on, please do feel free to get those questions out there, and I'll keep an eye on that, and we'll just keep throwing our prepared questions at the panelists. But yeah, definitely want to answer anything that you all have on top of mind. And let's go ahead and Emily, do you want to ask the next one?
Sorry, muted. You know, one of these days I'll figure it out. I think I'm really curious, especially maybe for you, Erica, you know, kind of on the later stages of this work. What positive outcomes have you seen as a result of doing your vulnerability assessment and your adaptation planning? Either that you expected, and so you're checking that box and saying, yeah, we achieved this objective, or unexpected?
I would say, I think in true Truckee form, we had a pretty good turnout in terms of public engagement, and we definitely tried to think outside of the box in terms of how we engaged at the workshops. I forgot to mention that, you know, we we changed the venue. We didn't have any of the workshops, the public workshops, I should say, at Town Hall, recognizing the sensitivities to holding a workshop in the same place where our police department is held, for instance, and just trying to go out in a more neutral space in the community. I think that was important. We also tried different things like holding the workshops at different times, providing food, having childcare available even, and really just trying to cast a wide net there. And the other thing that we did was different kind of interactive art pieces for the groups, as well as integrating different speakers and artists to kind of inspire people as we set the stage, to really hook people in to the participation. I would say where we're at right now, it's definitely an interesting process because much like Quincy, we wrote everything down. You know, we annotated exactly what policy idea was from what workshop, and whether it was from one of our stakeholders or from a member of the public. So we really did a great job of capturing that community engagement. Currently, I would say that it's almost to our detriment because we have so many policies. So now that as we're entering the implementation stage and really trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to do now? I would just say be mindful of that in your prioritization. I think that is so important. And also, yeah, just setting yourself up for success in the implementation, because you can brainstorm a million great ideas and solutions, but to actually be able to move the needle, we need to have realistic, actionable items. And so that's something that we're working on right now, is kind of setting those items and not having necessarily like 75 policies to implement all at once. You know, starting out with bite sizes that we can really get off the ground.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It sounds like an incredible engagement process, but also, yeah, a lot to respond to. Tracey or Quincy or Claire, did you have anything else that you wanted to chime in? I know you're kind of more in the midst than you know, witnessing the outcomes of your work.
Yeah, and actually echoing Erica, I think I am right now in exactly that mindset of, you know, starting with or thinking about the end in mind. When we're looking right now, I mean, Claire, you know, we started with the big list and we're paring it down to Plumas County, but then even there's, you know, what they call sensitivities, and then which are critical sensitivities, and, you know, and how many sensitivities do we have? And so right now, I mean, there's like a list of 26 or something, you know, it's like, oh, so I think even trying to really hone in and set criteria to do so that we have, you know, a measure of why we made the decisions we did and what are the priorities for Plumas County and so forth. So yeah, definitely thank you for that, Erica, because I was, you know, I have those thoughts and how we may be able to make this manageable, because again, capacity and an implementation, you know, if you can't get there, then what's it for? So, you know, trying to really make manageable capacity decisions now for then the end game once implementation comes. And I think the biggest challenge also being, you know, kind of smack dab in the middle of the vulnerability assessment is, you know, the new language that I'm learning, and the APG is really helpful. You know, I mean, all the terms and definitions and so forth, but as a planner, certainly knowing process and so forth and terms, but this, you know, again, I like in local hazard mitigation, it's a hazard, and here it's an exposure, and, you know, and just, yeah, just learning the language of climate adaptation, you know, vulnerabilities and sensitivities and critical sensitivity. So, I mean, the more you're in it and immersed in it, and Quincy, like you, I'm the only staff person working on this project. So I feel that too. And Claire mentioned, you know, 2-week check-ins, and I said, yes, let's do it. And so that's a great point too. I mean, keeping on task, keeping it on the to-do list at the top, near the top, is helpful. And then just immersing yourself in it and being patient with yourself too. Because I'm, you know, it's like, yeah, I get a little impatient, you know, with myself. So I gotta just, you know, take a breath and you know, keep working on it and refining and understanding.
Excellent. So we did have one question come in from the audience, and I know we're short on time, so maybe quick thoughts, and then we'll do a kind of final thoughts wrap up. The question is, how much has COVID impacted, one, your perception or approach to vulnerability planning, and two, your process for outreach, engagement, and community buy-in? I know we touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, just being virtual. So Claire, we set up some focus groups. So basically it was, you know, a webinar focus group to certain sectors, and, you know, invited anyone and everyone, my 200 plus stakeholder list. And, you know, we did get good, you know, good participation. I think in the webinar format, there's always the challenge. I mean, people are putting things in chat, or they don't want to speak up, or they don't want to, you know, make comments. So there's a balance there. And then we offered, you know, both comments during the webinar in whether it be a verbal format or the chat format, and then send out an email afterwards to say, you know, if you'd like to provide more feedback, here's, you know, 3 weeks, and get your comments to us. So we've yet to receive many, or if any, comments from that, you know, but I think with COVID, it's been a virtual environment, of course, more so, but coming out of that now, hopefully with people that are, you know, if we're transitioning back into physical workshops, but I think hybrids are, you know, may work as well in the next 6 months, so.
Yeah, it's all virtual. I mean, it was totally different. We wouldn't have done any of the things that we did if it hadn't been for COVID. So, and I highly doubt we would have had 80 people at our first workshop. So, yeah, that's probably the biggest change. I don't know that COVID specifically as a pandemic changed what the text. I'm not sure if that's part of the question, or changed the outcome of the report. But then again, I haven't done a vulnerability assessment before, so I don't know if it's different than what it would have been pre-2020.
All right, thank you. Well, we are kind of just in the nick of time here, and I don't want to keep anyone over, either our attendees or our panelists, but at the same time, I want to give our panelists a chance for any final thoughts that you may have. If you don't, that's also okay, or if you got to move on to the rest of your afternoon, we totally understand. But so I'll open it up in just a sec, but first of all, thank you so much, Tracey and Erica and Quincy and Claire, for joining us. I could keep listening to this conversation for like another hour and a half. So hopefully this will be valuable to folks. And thank you, Nikki, for setting us up so well to understand what we're working on here, and what the requirements are and the guidelines are. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. And yeah, and if any of our panelists or Nikki as our kind of co-facilitator want to add any final comments, we welcome you to do so. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say, you know, Nikki did do a great job in setting up and how we can nest the different, you know, legislative requirements together with safety element, housing element, local hazard mitigation plan, and so forth. And so really, I think that step one, you know, how you're thinking and exploring your process, looking at the legislation, you know, text itself, look at that government code section, what is really required to understand, and then map it out, you know, and like Quincy said, it may take you twice as long, or, you know, because of whatever, but, you know, I think it's just starting it, you know, and thank you again to Civic Spark, or to, you know, to Claire as a fellow and Sarah Business Council, because for me, I just needed to start it, you know, and now that we're in it, it's, it's flowing and we'll get there. Are we going to hit January 1? No, but we're going to get it done next year sometime. So I think if you haven't yet started, don't be discouraged. Just get started, move through the process. So many resources out there, reach out and you'll be, successful.
And I would just offer, if there's any documents that we have that would help anyone, from an RFP to a contract to a whatever, just email me. It's in the chat. Happy to send it on. Nothing proprietary. And our county website, if you go to the homepage and you type in Climate Action Plan in the search bar, you can go to our project webpage, and we've got all of our PowerPoints. Our meetings are recorded, and you can link to our Conveyo platform if you want to see how that works. So happy to help anyone if they need anything regarding climate change.
I would also say the same thing. If people have any questions, they can definitely reach out to me. And also, just like a final piece of advice on the process, I would just really recommend like looking at the APG and like mapping everything out for a process before you go about it. Like I said earlier, I think at least I had the tendency to just jump right in and start like gathering a bunch of resources and just started writing things. And I wish hindsight that I did a little bit more like preparing and planning. So like phase 1 of the APG, I guess, with that defining and scoping. Yeah, but again, if anyone has any questions, I can put my email in the chat again.
I'll just say that I dropped in the link for climatewise.org, which is GEOS Institute's website, and they have a really great synopsis of our stakeholder outreach engagement process, and also has a full copy of our vulnerability assessment on there.
I don't think I have anything else to add. I mean, this has also been great for me to hear all of the different stories from you all who are actually doing the work. I do want to just highlight that the online interactive version of the adaptation planning guide does include a couple of different templates and resources throughout. There's an example scoring sheet, vulnerability assessment sheet, community engagement templates. It's all very kind of simple and just kind of like broad brush stuff. So you'll want to probably customize for your work, but check those out.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for participating and joining us today. And we wish you a great rest of your afternoon, and stay cool, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.